This is the first lecture that will detail the function of several metabolic hormones that regulate the plasma concentration of nutrients. Every cell goes through metabolic processes every second of the day. You should be familiar with these schemes. You have inputs and outputs from this. Your inputs generally come from your diet or from stores, and then your output is ATP or energy, and it depends on what the cell wants to do at the moment. You have catabolic processes, which is usually the breaking down of large molecules into small molecules producing energy, but you also have anabolic, which is then the creation of large molecules from smaller parts, creating lipids, proteins, and polysaccharides that the body needs for its function. At, at But the need for ATP is central to all this, because whether it's anabolic or whether you just need energy for functions, everything needs energy, and the gasoline that your body runs on is ATP, and so there needs to be a constant level of this. And in order to do that, the plasma concentration of nutrients needs to be regulated so that it doesn't fall too low or doesn't get too high. And so we have inputs to the system from GI absorption, release from stores, or synthesis that then changes the plasma concentration of anything, and then your output then is either catabolic use for energy, storage, or excretion. And our body has an energy balance. It's constantly using energy for mechanical work, synthetic reactions, membrane transport, all uses ATP, and the input then comes from storage or diet. And depending on how long it's been since we've eaten, the stores will be more pulled from. If we have recently eaten a meal, most of the input will come then from the GI tract. But the plasma concentration needs to be regulated, and this is done at the neuroendocrine level. So the need to regulate plasma content is because our availability of food varies. We eat 3 or 4 times a day and then go several hours without eating, and so the availability from different sources changes, and then our demand varies. We can be sedentary for a couple of hours and then get up and quite happily run for several minutes without too much of a deleterious effect. But the rate of absorption from the GI tract is not regulated. The body will try and absorb as much as possible, and obviously this is going to increase the substrate concentration in the plasma. The one we're going to focus on mostly, because it's central to the body's metabolism. It has a central location in the interconvertibility of substrates, and it's one of the main energy molecules of the body, and that's glucose. And it's important to realize that when blood glucose gets too low, there are serious consequences. The central nervous system will shut down within minutes, and so the body has several hormones that can regulate, through its actions on the liver, the concentration of blood glucose. But also we need to keep that level from getting too high, because there are long-term chronic conditions that happen through poor regulation of blood glucose, and so the body tries quite hard to maintain the blood glucose concentration within normal limits. And so what are these normal limits? Well, fasting blood glucose levels range from about 70 to 100 mg per deciliter, but after a meal these can spike up to about 140 mg per deciliter. Generally the average person will have a blood glucose of about 80 mg per liter. So the maintenance of this glucose concentration in the blood is through two mechanisms: either entry of glucose into the bloodstream through absorption of the GI tract, or from release of stores from glycogen in the liver, or removal of glucose from the bloodstream via uptake by the muscles, the liver, and the adipose tissue to reduce blood glucose levels. How does glucose get into cells? Well, it's impermeant, and so it needs to have a molecule that helps it get across. In the gut, we talked about the sodium glucose symport, using a sodium gradient to draw in glucose from the lumen of the GI tract. In the body, it's just facilitated diffusion, and all cells have at least one type of glucose transporter, this GLUT1, and it provides basal glucose uptake for all cells. It's important to note that it is independent of insulin, and there are several other GLUT molecules that are actually much more than are listed here, but I've just put down the ones that you really need to know. And it's important to note that whereas many of these GLUT transporters are insulin independent, there is one, the GLUT4 transporter, that is insulin dependent, and this allows insulin a way to then upregulate these transporters in order to clear plasma or reduce plasma concentrations of glucose. Also important to note that it is just facilitated diffusion. What happens is glucose binds, you get a conformational change, and the glucose then passes through the other side of the membrane. That's all it does, it acts as a gate. And so the driving force for glucose movement is then diffusion down a concentration gradient. And so it's just going to flow from high concentration to low concentration, facilitated by these GLUT transporters. The hormones controlling blood glucose are listed here, and these are the hormones that we'll be talking about. You have insulin secreted from the pancreas, from pancreatic beta cells, and it's a protein. Glucagon is secreted from alpha cells in the pancreatic islet, and it's a small peptide. And these kind of are antithesis of each other. When insulin's there, generally glucagon isn't, and vice versa, but there are some exceptions to that. Then there's epinephrine, which comes from the adrenal medulla, and growth hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary, and then cortisol, which comes from the adrenal cortex. Now, glucagon, epinephrine, growth hormone, and cortisol all raise blood glucose levels, and insulin is the only one of these that actively works to lower blood glucose levels. Other hormones that we talk about during this block will include thyroid hormone. This is a very important hormone controlling your metabolism, because it acts as like your body's thermostat. When there's a lot of thyroid hormone around, you're at a higher energy level, and with less thyroid hormone, your energy levels are just naturally lower because your overall respiratory rate of your cells are reduced. And then we'll mention briefly vasopressin and aldosterone, because they're involved in the response to exercise and stress. You should be familiar with the nomenclature of metabolism. It will help you through these lectures, and there's essentially two groups. You have the creation of molecules, genesis, to create. So glycogenesis is the synthesis of glycogen. Gluconeogenesis is the formation of new glucose, and then you have proteogenesis, lipogenesis, and ketogenesis, and these are all creations of molecules involved in metabolism. And then you have lysis, to cleave, to break, and then glycolysis is obviously a very important central pathway in breaking down glucose into pyruvate. And then you have glycogenolysis, proteolysis, lipolysis, to the breakdown of the other macromolecules.